Laude Diem to all students of the American Constitution, and welcome to our winter-spring season of the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius, aka the 4Bs. Remember, that is the 4Bs and not the BGs, okay? We just want to be clear about that. I am excited to facilitate more conversations on the Constitution and hope that you are excited to consider the thoughts and questions posed here by the Beatles of the American Constitution. We don't know which one of us is John, Paul, or George, but we definitely are very clear on who is Ringo. In all seriousness, just in case you are new to the program or have forgotten who we are, let us take a moment to introduce. I am David Richmond, the moderator of the Constitution and American Life. I have been involved in We the People since its inception in 1988 as a teacher, mentor, and coordinator, and worked for the Center for Civic Ed from 2006 to 2011 as the state coordinator of the California programs. We have with us our guru from the great state of Wisconsin, Professor Tim Moore, from the Center on the Study of the Constitution at UW-Madison. With us also is the suave and debonair man from the Midwest, Professor Chris Kavanaugh. He has been with the We the People program for over 25 years as a teacher and mentor in the two great states of Indiana and North Dakota. Lastly, we have our Ringo, just in case you were wondering. We have our Ringo, our poster child of the sexy professor, Dr. James Michael Williams from the Department of Political Science, University of San Diego. Dr. Williams has been involved with the We the People program for over 20 years as a scholar and judge, and in fact was a member of the East Bakersfield High School class of 1987, who was a school that was part of the pilot program for the We the People and the Citizen of the Constitution. I forgot to mention that Professor Moore's been a part of the program in so many different ways for over 30 years there. I think he's the senior man from Wisconsin. I don't know the state real well, but I think he's been involved longer than anybody in the state of Wisconsin. We are very excited about this season, as I said, as we will be discussing topics ranging from the thoughts of Socrates and democracy to Mercy Otis Warren and aristocracy and tyranny. We will look at issues like popular sovereignty, the efficacy of large republics, and religious freedom throughout American history. So let's begin our first episode. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the views of Socrates regarding pure democracy and how the framers of the Constitution were influenced by the classical thinkers. Let's start. I want to start off these episodes with a question to all of the friends of Publius. And what I'd like is kind of a fairly brief reaction that you had when you first saw this question. That is, upon first glance at this question, what stood out or what stands out as the key idea themes for students to focus upon? Professor Williams, Ringo, just first glance, what's the thing that jumped out at you?
You know, to be honest, I thought, man, so for some students, this might feel like a trick question because, I mean, to state that what are the primary characteristics of democracy and refer to Socrates, as I'm sure we're going to get into, Socrates was not a fan of democracy in theory or in practice. And so I think that for me, it was just like, okay, so let's be on the alert to think about Socrates's critiques of democracy and maybe apply some of those to how democracy works in the modern era rather than the ancient period.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Kind of dovetailing with Mike in the fact that democracy is defined by Plato, see Socrates, is not necessarily the democracy that we think of today. So there is a large gap in time, obviously. So make sure when you're wrestling with Socrates / Plato, that you're paying attention to what they believe to be democracy. And I know we're going to get into that in a little bit, and the framers and the founders and what we think of democracy today, because they are kind of different creatures.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, Chris's point is well taken. I like Mike's is this a trick question? Actually, my first thought was and it's going to be a book recommendation. Carl Richard has a fantastic book, and the title is Greeks and Romans Bearing Gifts: How the Founders Read and Misread the Ancients. So it's a great book to go to delve into the, as Chris says, you look at these cats and what they were thinking about the meaning of words at their time. But Carl's book is fantastic in the sense that he gives you, in a sense, okay, let's accept the premise of the question that the founders were really into the ancients, but they also got a little selective in how they appropriated their thinking. So I would start out right away. My first thought was see Carl Richard's book, Greeks and Romans Bearing Gifts.
Well, the first thing that jumped out at me was the term license. And just to show that I am the least educated of the group here, I'm kind of going, what the hell does this have to do with driver's licenses? So, this just tells you what I was thinking. So let's start off with Professor Moore. Tim, it seems to me that, at least the way I read things, that we find somewhat of a symbiosis between Socrates and James Madison in regards to their views on democracy. What do you think about that observation? You think I'm onto something there?
I think you are. And I think if you look into Madison's, and the easy go-to there is Fed 10. But I'm going to suggest that Madison was quite grumbly about direct democracy very early. I mean, he, in 1770s, he saw, as a young man, 25, 26, he saw Virginia Baptists getting beat up in Virginia by, he called them a mob. He also, earlier than Fed 10 and I will put this in definitely in the resource section. He had a wonderful memo he wrote to himself. It's called Vices of the Political System, specifically item number 11. In the Vices is a long memo, and most of it is why states are out of control and there's too much democracy at the state level. But in the middle of it, item number 11, he really addresses, in a sense, kind of the psychology of mobocracy in people, but also how it shows up in legislatures. And so my point being here, before we even get to Fed 10, he's writing about the problems with democracy because he's seeing it firsthand in the 70s. And later on in the 80s, he's famous for taking on Patrick Henry and what he perceived to be a tyranny of the majority in terms of wanting an assessment, a religious assessment. So long before Fed 10, there are examples. I mean, he also writes, here's an interesting thing that I also ran across in some preparation. Sprinkled throughout his writings in the Federalist Papers, he kind of beats up on the ancients. I've got these in Fed 14. He beats up on Greece and Rome. In Fed 38, he's real cranky with these constitution creators. It's all top down, these salons, and he goes through all of these people in ancient history where it was a top down, take it or leave it kind of constitution. Fed 55. So sprinkled throughout the Federalist Papers, he's addressing the ancients in a not so flattering way. But I think you are right that he like Plato and Socrates was a little greatly suspicious of democracy, the demos.
And
Chris or Mike, any thoughts on Tim's observations?
Well, I think that I was listening to Tim and made me think about the mischief at the states that Madison always referred to. And if you students probably already heard us say this, but Madison's looking to put a national veto over states, right? So ideally, that was something that was very important to him. He tried to get in the body of the Constitution, tried to get in the Bill of Rights, and was not successful. But so these democracies perhaps run amok. Democracy's gone wild. I don't know, at the state level. So he's trying to put that backstop, if you will, into the Constitution to prevent some of that. But of course, he's not successful.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I haven't read Richard's book, but because of Chris' recommendation, I've read Ricks's book on first principles. And Ricks's argument, at least, is that the founders were much more influenced by the Romans than by the Greeks, and that someone like Jefferson even said something. I forced myself to read Plato's Republic and I could barely get through it. It's all abstract and I don't know what, that kind of thing, right? Exactly. Good for Jefferson. So I'd add, and I'd also add that, and I'm not sure whether we would all agree this is a form of the kind of democracy Socrates is talking about, but the founders also in society at the time, town hall meetings, at least in the Northeast, were a very popular way for bodies to make decisions, and juries, which is one of the few sort of provisions in the Constitution that provide a right for us to have. I could make the argument that juries are a form of pure democracy that obviously Socrates would not be in favor of, since a jury sentenced him to death. So I agree with Tim, but I think that there is also something in the culture at the founding period where forms of this direct democracy are alive and well.
So Chris, let's delve into a little bit into Socrates here, and by association, and maybe making the association is an error by me, but by association, to what extent did Socrates and the framers believe that pure direct democracy would lead to tyranny? I mean, is that the fear that ultimately this will lead to a tyrannical government, and why for so?
This is, I shared this with Tim, but how exciting my Friday night was. I busted out my copy of Plato's Republic and started rereading some passages because it's just crazy here. I'm telling you.
Well, what else does one do when it's 4 degrees? I
actually, it was -17, but that's neither here nor there. That's without the wind chill, but details. And just for students to remember too, and I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, but we're going to take Plato at his words that Socrates said this, because this is Plato writing for Socrates. Kind of some biblical overtones there, perhaps, but we'll just throw that there. That this is Plato's Republic, not Socrates' Republic, where he's writing about it. And if you read, as I did, the Republic, Plato's or Socrates' original description of democracy sounds wonderful, because gosh, you can just do whatever you want. Everybody's treated the same, whether you've been guilty of a crime or whether you've been asked to serve on a jury. You don't have to serve, and whether you're, you can do what you want. But as he goes on, it really becomes about anarchy. Pure democracy is anarchy, and really, to break down, the word demo is the Greek word for the people, but really is the poor people. This is who they're worried about, are the poor people taking over in terms of ruling. So the idea of democracy in Plato's or Socrates' original description sounds wonderful, except you realize that nobody is bound by any type of law. Therein lies the problem, because it delves quickly into mob rule, or no rules. Honestly, anarchy is what it's like. And I think the framers, and as Tim alluded to, I think he talked about Fed 55. That was Madison, and Madison's like, the line in there is like, if every person in the Athenian Senate was a Socrates, it would still be a mob, right? So he's kind of ripping on this, and I would tell students, and I'll put this link in the resources too. A great place to take a look at is John Adams in his writing in defense of constitutions of the United States of America, because he's constitutions plural, because he's referring to state constitutions, and he rips apart their idea of democracy. So I don't know that the question, David, I'm thinking about your original question here.
Well, tyranny. So I mean, I guess there's just this, if you have the breakdown of like we'll call it civil society, into anarchy, then the next step is going to be, is it going to be tyranny, I mean, is he talking about a democratic form of tyranny?
Well, I think I think what the students may be more familiar with is tyranny of the majority. It would be majority tyranny because to think about this as, straight up as we kind of understand democracy, our modern definition, as opposed to Plato. And something else to point out too, when Plato / Socrates, I'm sorry if this is confusing students, but Plato is writing about this. Understand there are about 250,000 people in Athens as a population, give or take a few, and only 50,000 are citizens. Approximately 50,000 are citizens that are actually qualified for that. So women definitely do not qualify. Slaves, enslaved people do not qualify, and people that are going to be considered foreigners. I don't remember the Greek word off the top of my head, but people that would be considered foreigners don't have a voice. So even when they're talking about this democracy delving into anarchy, it's still a very, very limited democracy, even by Plato's take on things. I think that's important. And you see the parallels, obviously, in our founding era, when we talk about, all men are created equal. Well, we know that that's only white male property owners. So it in essence, is a very, very, very limited democracy. And we see that.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think Tim already said it. You can see the framers and the founders already, challenging this viewpoint from Socrates and Plato and other Greeks as well, in terms of their a view of things.
Well, go ahead, Tim.
And Chris's last comment is very important. I just want to harp on that. One of the things they obviously reject is Plato's solution is the philosopher king. So they're rejecting several things, democracy, but they're also rejecting the solution for, Plato doesn't believe the Athenian, you put 5,000, was it 6,000 people actually consisted of the Athenian assembly. So his solution is, okay, you put all those citizens in there, you're still going to need a philosopher king. And our founders are rejecting that. So there's a lot of, that's why I think Richard's book is so good, that points out the things they accept and the things they don't, and the things they misread. So Chris's point is well taken about the things they're rejecting.
Well, I think this is the perfect time for me to develop my own understanding. This term license, is that equivalent, democratic license? Is that equivalent to anarchy, Chris? Is that what he's meaning by this? I
think license is another word for freedom. Because when I was trying to find the exact passage, and in my copy, I did not find the word license being used. So unfortunately, we're through translations. But as I understand the several pages that I read, I think he's really, when he's describing these beautiful things about democracy, and actually in my copy of the translation, he refers to it as a she, right? That it sounds wonderful, but that I would think of license as being freedom, because you're free to do whatever you choose to do. And we know that flies in the face of, and students should know this, obviously, that flies in the face of everything we teach about classical republicanism. As you as an individual can, do what I want.
Mm-hmm. So his fear that this democratic license, this freedom to do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do, however you want to do it, is going to lead to anarchy.
Clearly, yes.
Well, the founders distinguished liberty and libertine. Libertine was, to Chris's point, just do whatever the heck you want to, and there's no restraints. That freedom on steroids is, and that's the accusation of the French Revolution. It's run by libertines, whereas the founders are going to, in a sense, frame liberty within structure, and I think they use libertine and liberty to parse that out a little bit.
Yeah, and it's not,
go ahead, Mike.
I don't think it's just, I think the way I usually teach this is like, okay, so what are the cases against democracy? Why should the many not rule? And one of them is, it just, you can make the argument that it leads to anarchy, which is meaning that with everyone ruling, no one's ruling. That's going to be one fear of it. A separate fear would be tyranny of the majority, right? That a segment of the people would make decisions that could thereby hurt those who are not in the majority. And you could go down the list of reasons why the many should not do it. I mean, Socrates has this great story he tells, asking, comparing to running a government like operating a ship. And he asks, when you're on a ship, do you want everyone on board to take a turn at leading it? Or do you want the person who is like qualified to actually operate the ship? And he's like, obviously we want the person who's qualified. So to me, it's like, I think students could, by thinking about this license to do everything we want, there are some subcategories out of that the students could think about how that is bad in terms of governing a society, right?
Well, Mike, it seems to me, and again, I had to do probably more prep than I've done on maybe any other question, because the biggest gap in my academic resume, if you want to call it that, is classical studies. But it seems to me that Socrates fears, he's talking about instability that is born out of too much democracy, and that he's setting up the necessity of kind of a cultural indoctrination, that builds a virtuous citizen. Are we on the same page there? Then in a way, he's arguing about this necessity to build within the citizenry a concept of the common good and the polis in general.
And it's a good question. And I'm not a political theorist by training. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but I just want to make sure all my political theory friends who are watching this will know that I'm speaking a bit out of turn. But my reading of Socrates is that he's not all that concerned about a virtuous society. Like, he's pretty convinced that most people are kind of idiots. Most people are beyond sort of being, again, this is to Chris's point, this is Socrates through Plato, right? That what you want to find is the wise people in society to make the rules to control the others. And the others are going to be selfish, they're going to be dumb, they're going to make bad decisions, and we may or may not be able to change them, but at least by having a philosopher king or having a rule by the few that are wise, at least you can keep the society stable and in order and protect yourself from other societies who want to invade you. So my reading of Socrates, I don't see a lot of him being concerned about societal virtue, but I may be misreading it. So I open it up to others to comment.
Another thing that the founders pick up on, and this again shows up in the Vices document number 11, is in all through the ratification debates too. There's this question of demagoguery. To this point that we've been talking about, is the citizenry smart enough to govern? And the argument often was made that ignorant people are vulnerable to demagoguery, those leaders that don't have virtue, that can manipulate just for the sole purpose of power. And so I think there is some classical thinking in that, the need for virtue in leadership, because if you don't have that virtue in leadership, you have a straight up demagogue, and they know how to manipulate.
But don't you need that virtue in the citizenry as well, Tim?
Because you would like to believe that the masses can see a demagogue, from 100 miles. Now, and it's not just a recent problem, by the way. We've always kind of had our problems with demagoguery, and it challenges that note. It's a great question, David, and that's the Jefferson quote: "That's an enlightened citizenry is needed." So the demagoguery is also a thing that's big for the founders, because they realize we have somewhat of a quasi-democratic experiment. We're not going to have philosopher kings, so we do have to realize the vulnerability of the system to having demagogues.
Chris, I agree with Mike that Socrates through Plato isn't isn't directly doing so. I'm just trying to extrapolate here about, okay, what's the end result of his arguments against democracy? And again, his fear is of instability and anarchy. And it seems to me that, okay, what we have to do then, even if they're stupid, all right, that the community has to raise each child with some element of virtue here in order to have the kind of stability that Plato's advocating. Does that make sense, Chris?
Oh yeah, perfectly. Well, we've talked for years, and I think that is in Unit 1, which is what we're grappling with here, is in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, that citizens were made; they were not born. And so by being made, they have to be educated. And so they do have to have that common education, because personalities being what they are, that people, some people have a natural ability to spot a demagogue 100 miles away, and other people wouldn't know them if they walked up and shook hands with them. So there is that need for that common education. But remember too, and again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, you're dealing with a smaller group in Athens, right? That you're thinking about here in terms of being able to rely on that civic virtue, because those are the people with the power.
But
citizens.
I know we're going back and forth now between Socrates and the founders. So we're going, but
that's what we do.
I know, but the students should realize, like, the fact that the founders chose to have any kind of democracy goes against the teachings of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. They thought it was going to be a fool's errand, right? So the questions Dave is asking right now is kind of like, okay, given the warnings that Socrates has, what should we be like? How can we protect ourselves from these warnings? Which I think is excellent. But I think even in the small society that Athens was, in practicing its direct democracy, Socrates would say it was still awful. Like, it had everything going for it, and it was still unwise, and it still did not function the way he thought a society should function. So
absolutely agree with that, for sure, because it is, the way again, as I said earlier, the way he writes about it sounds like a wonderful place, then until you realize there's actually no order.
Right.
And that's his whole point. This is why democracy is bad. And if we go from Socrates to his student Plato to his student Aristotle, this for the students, there's that great chart in Unit 1 with that whole idea of mixed government. So from Aristotle, and then we see these concepts of mixed government. We see pieces of them, right? It's not, you just can't lift up Aristotle's model and apply it to, say, John Adams' Constitution of 1780 in Massachusetts, or to the U.S. Constitution of 1787. But you see things that are similar there. So the idea is the cure for democracy is a mixed government.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, did you want to?
Yeah. When David, you asked your question, you kind of there was two words in your question that really got my ears pinned back. You asked the question, does the Republic require cultural indoctrination? And the word cultural and indoctrination kind of got my ears. I mean, one man's indoctrination is another man's national curriculum, frankly. So I wonder, and I think, think about this. Our founders wanted to create a national university, and they thought maybe Georgetown would be that place. And that would be the place where these young men from all over the country would come, and they would have a shared experience, but also that there's I wouldn't call it cultural indoctrination. Well, all right, another potato. I don't know, but the founders did believe that there had to be some glue to hold society together. And maybe the National University movement, maybe Horace Mann's onto something there in the 1830s and 40s with a statewide curriculum that was looked at by other states around. So we've always kind of wrestled with what are we going to I would say educate our citizens with now. And some people see it as indoctrination. So maybe you're right, but I would say that the educational agenda of the country has often factored into that. To your question, how much does education factor into creating a people that are suited for this quasi-democratic Republican form of
Well,
government.
well, let me just say, and this is why I ended up falling in love with this question, because to me, it leads us down the path of addressing, I think, a core issue in today's America, and that is civic education, and that is the kind of the, I guess, the binary choice we're being presented with, 1776 or 1619,
Right.
and that's probably too simplistic. But I know you're very aware, Professor Moore, of okay. To me, civic education is not indoctrination, although it can be, and it has been in the past there. But the commission that the former president put together at the end of his term, the 1776 one, I think we'd all agree that was clearly on the edge of indoctrination. And I would argue that probably for most of our history, that's what civic education would have been seen as, is we're going to pound this love of country idea into you, not critical thinking, but love of country kind of idea. And that's why I used it. And of course, you saw me for what I am very quickly, because you know me very well. But I do think that there is an element of cultural indoctrination, or the term indoctrination, in civic education, which is necessary to create as virtuous a society as you can.
One more thing.
Of course.
Okay. I think my problem with 1619 and my problem with the 1776 thing is that they're partial. Frankly, I mean, I looked at the 1776 stuff, and there's some pretty decent stuff in there. There's also some good chuckles. But I guess the content of civic education is such fraught with so much controversy because of the specifics that particular framework, whatever framework it is, defines as civic education. And I think all of us would agree that, yeah, it's important to know, okay, how many stars are on the flag, but it's also important to know why we have judicial review. One curriculum might emphasize the rote and the simplistic, and another curriculum might emphasize the more sophisticated, administrative agencies and the balance of power. I mean, so the devil's always in the details of the content of civic ed. But your point is a fantastic point about civic ed is always in the crosshairs of this, as you call it, a cultural, I'll say it, cultural educational agenda.
So I've been reading a book about myths in American history. I think it's a fairly new book. In fact, Akil Amar, I think it's the second essay on myths on the Constitution there. And he deals with this myth about America not being a democracy there. And I think we know that there is a fairly strong, stream of thought that throughout the late 19th and then in the 20th about that notion. So let's just assume for a moment, Professor Moore, that it is accurate to say that America is in many ways anti-democratic. My question to you is, what elements of the Constitution were intended to restrain what Socrates called the democratic man?
Oh, golly, just about everything. Wow. Yeah. Judicial review.
Okay.
The amendment process is a very high bar. The Bill of Rights prevents the tyranny of roughshod democracies. Staggered elections really stifles democracy. Electoral college, the Senate, for heaven's sakes. The habeas corpus, prohibition of bill of attainder. You can't have legislatures trying you. I mean, full faith and credit. You can't run roughshod over a person if they go from one state to another or bring with them legal time. I mean, the Constitution is littered with anti-democratic clauses. I mean,
So is it fair to say that if it leans any way, it leans against the forces of pure democracy more than it leans against the forces of aristocracy or autocracy?
well, now, whoa. Don't. I mean, I could compose no, I don't. Just because it's one thing doesn't mean it swings to the opposite side of the pendulum. That's classic Dave Richmond right there. That's classic Dave Richmond. But I mean, that's the challenge of U.S. history, right? To walk that line between aristocratic systems and democratic systems, and sometimes we don't do it well. We swing that pendulum. To me, that's the beauty of American history. There is this struggle to walk that fine line between the demos and the aristocracy.
Well, I agree with that, but we're talking about the written word of the Constitution here. And your first reaction to my initial question was, well, the whole thing is.
But wait. You
The
didn't
whole
ask
thing.
me. But here's my retort. That's fair enough. But your question was about the U.S. national constitution.
Right.
So if we factor in federalism, there's a whole lot of demos going on at the state and local levels. So yeah, I mean, was it somebody we had here said they voted for dog catchers in their county or in their community? I mean, so your question was about federal national. I would respond by our federal system allows for a lot of demos going on at the state and local level.
Okay, so Professor Kavanaugh, I like doing report cards. So let's do a report card on the national constitution's ability to balance these competing interests, as Mr. Moore says has been with us, of excessive democracy. And I'm sorry, but the flip side of that coin is either autocracy or aristocracy at minimum. What grade do you give the Constitution? To me, again, based on Professor Moore's testimony here, is that this Constitution clearly, all right, does as much as it can to restrain Socratic democratic man, all right, than it does to restrain aristocracy.
Well, I'm listening to you guys go back and forth, and my mind is like, someone needs to do a continuum here, right? And we need to go from Socrates / Plato's idea of democracy to what happens as a result of the revolution, post-revolution, I don't know, I'll throw out something like Shays' Rebellion, and then a response being the Constitution. And then you want to keep going for, complete aristocracy or autocracy. Somewhere in there there's a continuum question. I think. But what grade would I give?
Well, we need the political scientists to make us a quick model, because we know that they're good at models there. So while Chris is continuing, Mike, if you could make us a good model there for us. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, Tim's pretty good at continuums too. So that's kind of part of his shtick. He's pretty good at that. But here's the thing, and the Constitution itself, in terms of limiting the evils of democracy, but not really being aristocratic, I'm going to give it a solid B plus. But there's a caveat here. There's been a lot of operator error, I would say, because the Constitution itself are merely words on paper, and how we've applied that and how we've used that. It's not Ron Popeil's rotisserie oven where you set it and forget it, right? And I think that part of the problem is the framers, Madison, maybe the worst, misread human nature. And I think what we've seen now with some of the things that Tim has mentioned, whether it be the Electoral College, eventually we get into gerrymandering, we get into money and politics. So these are all modern issues, students. But I think that operator error has moved us into a greater degree of aristocracy than what the founders had or the framers had originally intended. Maybe, because I think of like Fed 63, Madison's talking about the very, the very aristocratic Senate, which we've kind of seen. So I'm going to check myself on that. But I think that the Constitution itself does a good job. It's a solid BB plus, but our use of it has been woeful. Needs some remediation, perhaps some tutoring.
Professor Williams, since you're prone to great inflation, I'm expecting therefore an A- from you. What say you about Kavanaugh's observations?
Yeah, I'd give it. I mean, I'm trying to follow the conversations. This is great. I think my grade's going to be lower. I think Tim is right. I think that the Constitution, whether influenced by the Greeks or others, it's a conservative, anti-democratic system of government. I don't think it's pro aristocracy. I don't think there's elements in it other than maybe other than the Electoral College and the Senate. Supreme Court. But I mean, when I think about like a democracy, and again, as Chris has said, he's right. This term changes over time. But I think about, okay, what's the ability to participate in decision making, and then what are the rights that are afforded to you by either natural rights or by positivism? And as we've talked about previous seasons, there are very few positive rights in our Constitution. We have negative rights, things that the government can't take away, but the framers weren't all that impressed with putting positive rights in it. And in terms of participation, it seems to me they completely delegated to the states. They took a pass. I think as written, the Constitution is a pretty anti-democratic document. As practiced, I think we've made it more democratic than the founders would have envisioned in terms of participation and in terms of rights. Now, we haven't done that using maybe the mechanisms that the founders envisioned, right? The courts have been probably more involved than they thought, the administrative state. States have adopted direct democracy types of initiatives like propositions and referendums and stuff. But I think we definitely are more, the Constitution is more democratic today than it was when it was written.
So what about, so it seems to me, based upon what study I did, Socrates vis-a-vis through Plato is worried about stability, all right, or instability of democracy. So I guess if we phrase it that way, Mike, would you give the Constitution an A when it comes to promoting the stability of government and society vis-a-vis, and I don't know what the word would be, innovation of democratic government?
Yes. I think the founders, I'm stepping on way out on a limb here. I think the founders were just as, if not more, concerned about stability as they were with rights and participation. So yes, and I think the Constitution, Tim brought up the amendment process. That alone, freezes so much, right? And I think that was obviously by design. They wanted a document that was going to stand the test of time. So yes, I think I would give it a better grade for being harder to change. I don't know if I would give it a grade for being more stable, given that we've had a civil war and we've had other uprisings and things. But yeah.
Tim, Chris, if I rephrase it on stability versus democratic innovation, i.e. change, do you agree with Mike on that the Constitution has done a fairly good job, relatively speaking, when it comes to stability?
And again, Mike brings up the federalism issue with initiatives and referendums and that kind of experimentation at the state level. So I would agree with Mike on that.
Yeah, I think definitely provides that stability at the national level while still allowing states to function on a much more democratic system. But again, let's talk about the founding era. That's a very limited democracy. And over time, as Mike said, we've expanded that democracy. We've expanded that to encompass more people. But I think the Constitution, when it's ratified, it provides stability at the national level, which was needed, and still allowed enough space for the states to operate, to do what they needed to do, to be a much more small d democratic entities.
Yeah, but my comment on it is also allows the states to be small d democratic towards what I'll call tyranny. There,
Yeah.
I just don't fall for this notion
Which,
that the
which,
laboratories of democracy in the states
which,
are always progressive.
which goes back to one of my points earlier about Madison wanting the national veto, because he talks about the mischief of the states, right? These so the idea of like controlling these unruly states. But of course, Madison was not thinking about he's not thinking about equality of more people, that's for sure. He's worried more about property, I believe.
So, Professor Williams, since World War II, we have seen, and I don't know if it was, Professor Kermit Hall that first brought this notion up, and it's where I grabbed onto it. But we've seen the rise of the rights revolution and an intense focus upon individualism, which me seems to be a little bit of Socrates' democratic man. The right of the individual to be free, to be who they want to be, and to do things that at least up until that time were somewhat out of the norm. Identity, sexual identity, racial identity, all these things that we're dealing with today. And then we add to that the explosion of consumerism and media. Is it accurate to say, Professor Williams, that we may be living in Socrates' nightmare in 2023?
Yeah, I think we're living in Socrates' nightmare, perhaps maybe Madison's nightmare. There's a lot of nightmares that go around here, I think. I mean, I know that yes, the answer to your question is yes. And again, I'm just not sure, other than amongst the ruling elite, how much Socrates was concerned about civic virtue, what the Romans might call civic virtue. But to the extent that we have a society now where there's many more rights going around and individuals have much more say in the participation of the rules that govern us, Socrates, yeah, he would think that this is not the kind of society that's going to be very stable, very ordered, or bring about any sort of justice at all.
Chris?
I would agree. I think I was going back to David, your question about the word license, right? And I think if you ask people what they had the license to do today, they're probably just going to say whatever I want to, and you can't tell me differently, right? You can't make me wear a mask, right? You can't make me get a vaccination. You can't make me do this. You can't stop me from carrying my guns with me wherever I want to go. So the idea that I think we are, if we could bring Socrates / Plato back, he said, yeah, told you guys.
So how do you explain that, Chris? What do you see as kind of maybe the source of that? Because that wasn't the world that most of us here were born into. That world has changed drastically over the last few decades there. So is it just a rights revolution, or are there other elements of the cultural phenomenon that has created this democratic license?
I'm gonna Tim looks like he's ready to go here, so I'm gonna let him go.
I blame two people, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Freud. And the reason I blame Rousseau is because he's seen as one of these contractualists, social contract theorists. But his framework is totally different than Hobbes and Locke, in the sense that, what's the famous phrase? Man is everywhere free, but finds himself in chains. Now, for Rousseau, the answer is a minimalist, bare minimalist contract that maximizes personal liberty. Well, my point is, you run that out a couple hundred years, you insert the notion of and Freud, I think, is important to consider here, because he inserts the notion that that there's this primal individual instincts that we're beholden to. And in a sense, I think he unleashes the lion, so to speak. The minimal contract and the maximal liberty of Rousseau, run that out 150 years, and then you add the personal I would say libertinism of Freud. You run that out 100 years, and I think you have a society that is deeply committed to maximal individual liberty and minimal restraints, whether they be religious or governmental or cultural or whatever. So I think you have to consider these two individuals that are unleashing powerful, attractive ideas of individual liberty and freedom. That I think the chickens are have come home to roost on that.
I thought you were going to say Dr. Spock.
Well, I would say, okay, we'll throw him in there too, permissive parenting, blah, 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 which I don't.
And I think that, honestly, I do think there's, I said it somewhat flippantly, but I think there's also something to be said there as well.
Yeah.
Because, you know, for the teachers that are watching this, you can think about, especially for veteran teachers that are watching this, think about in terms of in your own buildings about accountability, right? In terms of, you know, obviously when 3 of us went to school, there was a price to be paid for doing stupid stuff, right? Well, I went to a Catholic school for a few years, so there was like the nuns were they were ninjas with rulers for sure.
Cultural gatekeepers, huh?
Yeah, something like that. Cultural enforcers. But I think there becomes a reflection of society, and I think we can. God, I hate to go back to the shift from the 50s to the 60s, but if you take a look in terms of the 60s revolutions, whether they be rights, civil rights, whether they be anti-war types of thing, I think you start to see the idea that, what was the adage? Question authority. Right, you see that coming out of the 1960s. It was the idea of question authority, because we found out that our government wasn't being honest with us about things. We found out that our government was complicit in limiting access to a better society for a lot of its citizens. So I think we start to see that there, and a pushback from people against that type of thing. And I think it's the pendulum, perhaps to go back to what Tim talked about, the pendulum. I think we've seen the pendulum go really, really far out to a degree without really a pushback towards a more classical Republican, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the idea of civic virtue.
Well, I think it's, question authority to me is kind of a fundamental core principle of the American way of life. So I think it's question authority plus the hedonism, all right, of the late 60s pop culture, that you have to kind of add it together, because question authority just by itself, to me, is actually a virtue, a Republican virtue.
But I'd see it, Dave, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. And I don't disagree with you. It's because we see that because, we find out about the truth, say, about Vietnam, right? But we also, you think of where we are today, and people will say, well, I did my own research about this COVID thing. And it's like, you looked up some stuff on the internet, and you're going to know more than people that have been studying infectious diseases for an entire lifetime that are medical people. So we've talked about this before, the lack of, trust in institutions, lack in trust in experts, because now people feel like they're their own expert.
Well, and this is probably going to shock all of you, but I think, Chris, it comes down to the breakdown of certain institutions necessary to civil society, or at least were, throughout, I think, much of our history. One would be family. When the divorce rate exceeds 50%, all right, and schools. Part of it is we all have to look at ourselves. To what extent have schools failed in teaching civic education, and focusing both on rights and responsibilities? And I'm sure, I don't know if you have the same experience, but as we travel around with work with teachers in classes, it's rights all the time. And you have to work hard to talk about responsibilities, in our civic society there. And to some degree, religious institutions, again, you look at the data, and and those institutions were all somewhat, important to the glue for democratic Republican society. And in many ways, they've all broken down and are no longer fulfilling or are providing the glue there. And like I said, I think that in itself reveals how much I've evolved over my years here for that even to come out of my mouth on that. So as always, time is our enemy. So I'd like to get to final insights and recommendations you'd make to students dealing with Socrates, the democratic man, and democracy in general. So Professor Moore.
I would urge students to study the swings. We've had periods where we've the progressive era. I would urge students to look at those swings when we've committed to, in some, whether it's economic democracy or whether it's political democracy, look for those events throughout the timeline where we've wrestled with democracy versus filtered representation or filtered democracy, republicanism. So I would look at the history and those times when there were slow and gradual changes.
Chris?
I agree with what Tim said. I would also make sure, as I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, there's not a straight line between Plato, Socrates, Aristotle to the framers and the founders to today. I mean, there have been fits and starts, as Tim would said, we've had swings and pushbacks. And so make sure you're not trying to draw that straight line between ancient Greece and ancient Rome to make sure we don't want to forget Cicero. And to today. And I would also, having a little inside information in terms of the questions, I would have anybody in Unit 1 wrestling with this question to sit down with my compadres in Unit 2 and compare notes on another question with, I'm going to get ahead of myself here with some information about Mercy Otis Warren. I think you might want to talk with your folks over that question, because you might find some similarities in terms of some of your study.
It's a good point.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I agree with both those points, and mine's a little different in terms of less on the substance of Socrates and more of what we know about him as a teacher. I think all of us during our time currently in the classroom or in the past would consider our method to be what we'd call quasi-Socratic. And what's meant by that, if the greatest things about reading Plato's memories of Socrates is the way Socrates invited conversation. He always had a point to make, but he did it by asking a lot of questions. And I think that students can take a lot away from that, like to ask why, to question premises, to get it to the real root of the matter. When I think of Socrates, I think more of his method, and then I think about his actual content. So I'd offer that up.
Yeah, students, before you do that though, make sure if anybody hands you something to drink, you might want to check it first.
Okay, we could go down that path for a while, and we're not going to do so. So, one of the things that the students are asked in this is to focus on how the Constitution addressed. And Professor Moore pretty much said, well, the whole dang thing is about restraining the Socrates notion of the democratic man. And I would suggest to students that you need to be fairly well informed about, as he talked about the pendulum swinging those extremes. That is, at what times have we maybe gone too far to restrain democratic impulse, and in what times, as we maybe finished our conversation, in which we unleash the democratic man and instability happens. But having a good sense of that pendulum through history, I think is extremely important there. So I hope we've enjoyed our conversation on Socrates by way of Plato and democracy here in our first session of the 2023 season. when we meet next time. In fact, Mr. Kavanaugh already kind of talked about it. We're going to be looking at Mercy Otis Warren and the notion of aristocratic tyranny. Again, a conversation I'm very much looking forward to, since I did a lot of homework this last week on Mercy Otis Warren and the Anti-Federalists here. So until that time, we hope that you're excited about getting started in preparation for the national finals. Until we see you again, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.